Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to episode 15 of Quarantine, coming to you today from San Francisco and from New York and from an audience and friends in many, many cities. As you all know who've been following this, we started this at the beginning of the pandemic because we were amazed by all of the innovation that was going on and the communities that were snapping to, both to look at the immediate problems and to think about the future. And at this point, we're squarely into a week that is thinking about the future and about what comes next. And you can see, in many ways, all of that comes down to the future of cities. They're the most complex organism that we have on Earth. And boy, do they hold in them kind of all of the issues of the future of retail, of density, of transit, of where people want to move and spend their dollars. So that's what we're going to get into today with a terrific group of friends. We'll have Kent Larson, who leads the City Sciences Group at the MIT Media Lab. And they were really pioneering a lot of work beyond smart cities and more into inclusion and dynamic planning before the crisis hit. And they have a lot to say. So we will talk to our friend Kent. And then across town in Boston, Nigel Jacob leads the Innovation Office in Boston, the Mayor's Office of Urban Mechanics. And that's the place that in real time has had to change. How does city government work? How does it respond to people in need? And now, how do you actually roll out systems that keep people safe and brings commerce back? And then back to San Francisco, and we'll talk to Jose Campos, who is one of the top redevelopment planners here. It was Jose's team that led the creation of the Transbay Center and what is now the Salesforce Tower, the pinnacle of transit-oriented dense urban development. Which suddenly all of these questions are these same assumptions. What happens to all that space in San Francisco? It's going to be a rich conversation today. And I think this is as rich and as complex a thing as comes about in the pandemic. It'll be the basis, I think, of a lot of conversations from here on in. There are two things that have been true about cities throughout the ages. And one is they're often in crisis. And the other is they're the pinnacle of our aspirations and our belief. Cities found themselves in crisis and accused of being dirty places in the era of the plague and of disease. Cities became in crisis during the Industrial Revolution in England when things were dense and weren't safe before we created any form of child safety or planning laws. They were in crisis before cars because of too many horses and horse manure, and afterwards because people went to the suburbs and there was white flight and cities got hollowed out. In many ways, that's where the modern era of cities begins. It's interesting to just set the context that after the 50s and the 60s, when people left cities and we gave up on them, it wasn't clear that they would become the dense crowning thing that they became. As recently as 1993, the futurist George Gilder said, well, the internet's coming, so clearly we won't need to be in cities. We can all work from home. Well, then everybody did move to cities because it turns out that the denser things were, the smarter cities were. And with the rise of things like cloud computing and technology, a few people in a relatively dense office building or startup space could create enormous value. Of course, then we went into the world where cities became kind of enormously too expensive and valuable. But it was pointed out by Geoffrey West. Geoffrey West at the Santa Fe Institute, who wrote his book Scale, pointed out that the reasons that cities became so popular was that the denser they became, the smarter they became, the more connections that were made. They actually nonlinear scale. They got richer and created more wealth at a rate faster than the number of people who were there. But there's another thing that Geoffrey West's math told him, which is that same density could lead to disease and pandemic if it weren't checked. Other parts of the world actually have planned for this better. Taiwan and Singapore and other Asian countries have actually figured out that they've had these pandemics before, so they have masks and they know how to be prepared for things, actually perhaps in a way that we haven't been prepared. That brings us to the present moment. To kick off today, I'm actually going to go through some recent headlines. When we were preparing for today, we just started looking at what are people saying about what's happening to cities or might happen to cities. So just yesterday, Sam Zell, one of the top real estate investors and industrialists, is interviewed by Bloomberg, and he's basically saying this could be a Depression era level event in terms of how long it lasts. Very worried about hospitality, about transportation related businesses, about office space. One of the conversations that's come up repeatedly is this one, this story out of New York. Now that so many people have been working from home, are they going to want to go back to work? Are companies going to want to pay all that overhead? Are they going to figure out they need maybe just fewer collective spaces for conference rooms? So there's a real question about whether people will abandon leases. Similarly, this has come up. If you've watched moving trucks, you may notice that there are plenty of moving trucks that show up in San Francisco. They're not moving people in, they're moving people out. There was a fascinating statistic last month that about 22% of renters in March either didn't pay or gave notice. When you have a new, young, nimble population, they have other places they might be able to go. And we've seen a lot of that going on. You also have rivalry between cities. This one out of Los Angeles, they're like, we had urban sprawl. Well, we got it right. This whole sprawl car thing, see, we're less dense. We're better off for the pandemic. And San Francisco had its own take on this. In TechCrunch, this article came. It was kind of like tech companies versus the real estate people. The tech companies are basically saying, we've learned to leave office buildings. So if we all go home, look at what we can do. And they basically did this statistic that you can see in a Twitter post that basically says we could take a whole bunch. Let's go to the next slide. You could take basically 3% of your expenses go into real estate. So you could basically get out of real estate, drop 1% to the bottom line. Basically, the tech companies saying to the real estate companies, we can disrupt around you. And just so that they're not accused of being too antisocial, they also point out you could turn a lot of that real estate into micro apartments and house everybody in San Francisco. So also just in the last couple of weeks, this headline came in. After the virus, what do we do with our public space? The San Francisco Jazz realized that they might have to go down to a hall of just a third of the number of people if they were to put in the proper social distancing. And it's not just culture. Retail is remarkably under fire. Derek Thompson has a very thoughtful piece in The Atlantic in which he talks about the retail apocalypse accelerating, the fact that the delivery economy is coming in, the fact that retailers and restaurants are in such small margin. So we'll get into that later when we talk to Jose here in San Francisco, because we have a very strong foodie economy, but that may not work if people don't want to go out or there's distancing. And Tim Wu, writing in the New York Times, says, what we really ought to take care of is our delivery at-home economy, because our just-in-time economy may be the most important one for times to come. So these are just headlines in the last couple of weeks that can tee up a great conversation here. But the conversation we're having about the fact that cities have to adapt to an era of resilience very much predates this pandemic. A year ago today, May 8th, 2019, I was giving a talk in Korea that Mickey and I worked in. And Mick, why don't you come in and join us? We were working on a talk called From Smart Cities to Cities That Dream, because we were noting that the mechanistic urge of smart cities, the urge that will make things ever more efficient, was beginning to give way in this era to actually meeting people's needs and having to build more resilient cities that adapt to crises faster.
Yeah, I think one of the ideas here was just that, the first wave of smart cities was in a sense about sort of going straight to the top, go to the city leaders, figuring out that you could in some ways sell to them, and you would basically, it was tech companies trying to sell routers or servers or some way to sense things, sensing who's at what parking space or sensing other kinds of things. But it was a very top-down approach. And what we were saying is, wow, what is happening at the city corner? What is happening at those little places that expand out into its community? Could we build community APIs? Could we look at how people thrive? Because people thrive in a place. We don't thrive in, just inside of our heads. We thrive with other people, our families, our friends, our community. And could we look at really algorithmic and emergent ways of doing things? Not saying I have a perfect theory of how a city works, but instead flip it over and really say, how do we enable that with some top-down guidance but allow for emergence to happen across neighborhoods and cities.
This is going to be a great setup for what we're about to get to with Kent. Many of the ideas that might have seemed science fiction a year ago, we need to take more seriously today. Why don't we bring Kent Larson in right now? Hello, Kent, and hello, Media Lab in Boston.
Hi, Mickey, Peter. It's great to be here.
Good to see you.
So we've all been collaborating for a while, and you have shared over the years in our collaboration ideas about bringing technologies that plan cities in real time, that allow us to adapt space. But it has to be the case that in the last month, as every assumption we have about cities, about space, about economy has been a bit changed, your lab itself must be adapting. So I'd love for you to kind of kick us off today with your thoughts on how you're approaching it, you, your team, your lab, and perhaps frame for us what we move into as we move beyond smart cities into something more resilient, for which this crisis has brought us full face.
Well, just in terms of my team, I mean, we're not building things anymore. We're working virtually, so we're dealing with simulation and modeling and the like. Let me give you just a bit of an update on what we are doing, and I think in almost every case, our work is not fundamentally changed, but we're repositioning it in light of the pandemic. What we're very aware of these days is how fragile the systems are in cities. We have empty streets, empty airports, closed workplaces, closed schools, empty shelves, unsafe transit systems. It's a pretty amazing transformation. We've been working for many years on what we call Cityscope. So it's a urban modeling simulation platform that uses tangible objects where the simulations can be updated in real time. We use a radar plot that you see changing up in the upper left, agent-based simulation. Here we're experimenting with augmented reality. We use a lot of telecom data analytics. For example, this is in Andorra, where we have multiple years of telecom data for the whole country. I'll talk about Andorra in a minute. And we spent a lot of time looking at land use patterns and its impact on mobility, commuting patterns. We built a lot of community engagement platforms. But now we're looking at specifically resilience metrics. This is one way that we look at information related to the city: density, diversity, proximity, the various systems that use energy. When we think about resilient communities, resilience in my mind is the ability to get stronger when you're stressed. I mean, that's what muscles do, it's what plants do. And so we're looking at metrics like public health and global warming and equity, metrics related to them. And the goal is to bring all of these systems together and simultaneously solve problems. ESG metrics, I think this is the future: environmental, social, and governance, and particularly related to the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have a project now. I don't intend people to read all this text, but just to give you a sense of the process, we take these 150 or so variables and we aggregate them down to a limited number where we can weight them. And what we're now doing is correlating them to the conventional ESG metrics designed for companies. But the next generation, I think, is to apply them to communities. So when a company comes in or there's an urban plan, what is the impact in terms of environmental, social, governance on that community? So we now have some funding. We hope to get some more to work on these ESG metrics. Now, the interventions we're thinking about, first of all, related to resilient workplaces. Kendall Square, where I work, they're now under construction for about 1 million square feet of space. The construction stopped. And of course, when we come out of the pandemic, the world will be very different. These are people in line with their masks, queuing up to enter a place. So we've repositioned our agent-based modeling, where we've been looking at mostly mobility, to, in this case, look at the flows of people in a factory. could be a school, it could be a hospital, it could be a shopping center. And then we can combine this agent-based model with a good epidemiological model and look in at least an approximate way of the areas of risk. This is a heat map showing safer zones in the factory and riskier zones.
So Kent, real quick, I mean, for the viewers, agent-based modeling is this notion of sort of spawning a bunch of virtual people that have goals. And they try to wander around and reach those goals, but you're able to kind of simulate it without actually putting people at risk for real. And so you can kind of start to see almost like a heat map or a flow, and that's what we're seeing here. Is that about right?
So in this case, you can tune how people queue, whether they're wearing masks or not, what the spacing of the desks would be, the width of the aisles, are they one-way, two-way? You know, there are many things that you can look at, and we don't know really in any great detail how the virus behaves, and a lot of it is whether you have a super spreader or not. But I think it can help people design policy and design places.
It's sort of like they can do what if a little bit. And I remember seeing some early agent-based modeling where they were trying to simulate how to get people out of a skyscraper during a fire. And it turns out, you know, putting the exit door and the stairs, the fire escape, worked okay. But because agents are each going after their own goal and they're kind of a swarm, putting something that actually broke up the flow increased the amount of people that could go down. It was kind of like a fluid dynamics problem. And I think that's the thing, is how do we help the people who are doing this design or trying to build a better, more resilient city? How do we help them do what ifs and find those maybe unintended consequences, but also find those little nuggets of, oh, wait, this would actually be a guidance for the architect or guidance for other people.
And if you're trying to reopen, say, a co-working facility, there are so many variables you have to take into account for which there is not good data. And any tool that we can give them that can help them make more informed decision, I think, is a good thing.
Well, and it also seems that just asking the questions and tracking the kinds of questions or queries or what ifs that they do teaches us a little bit about what's in their head. People aren't always good about articulating goals, but if you kind of let them experiment with things, they kind of find the goal in that process. It's a little bit like a give and take.
That's right. And what is so critical when we build these models, because we know they're not accurate, you know, hopefully they're useful. But if we can make the assumptions we've made transparent, so as we learn more over time, we can refine them. Then we can, you know.
So I want you to keep rolling. I just want to make sure we get clarification.
That's a good point. So if we go back to the video, what we were doing here in Shanghai, it was a living lab experiment. We were trying to increase human interaction and creative exchange of ideas, but now we're flipping that because we can use the same technique to look at problematic exchanges when people are too close. This is one of the spin-offs from our lab, looking at developing plans for grocery stores, for crowd management, for queuing, automated ways of telling when people are when it's safe to go into a store, Bluetooth beacons and other sensors around. Right now, humans do that. I think a lot of that can be automated. Another spin-off that is looking at a future where these office buildings are empty through downsizing, remote work. We will likely have people with different immunity credentials, so then you can tune the densities depending on your immunity. Homes are another thing we're looking at. I mean, as we're all realizing, particularly as a family, homes are not well designed for work or learning or entertainment or exercise or healthcare. All of these activities that we thought of as non-residential, maybe except for entertainment, are coming into the home. And if you live in a small urban apartment, it's really problematic. We're looking at building standardized chassis. I'm particularly interested in the very small units, the micro units, because they're the most difficult and challenging. This shows a 300 square foot apartment that can dynamically reconfigure itself from sleeping to working. Here's a Zoom studio that has optimized lighting and camera and green screen, et cetera.
So it's almost like a little robot. They're
little robot. This is actually an animation we did almost 10 years ago that showed exercise machines popping down. This is a recent project, a spinoff called Ori Living from my lab that I'm a co-founder for. So you see the bed going up, hiding away in the ceiling, and then that happens in an effortless, automated, magical way while she's making coffee. Resilient mobility. The key to mobility, I think, is good land use patterns. Here, this is a tool that we built for a project in Hangzhou, red, bad, green, good, where red shows lack of walkability to parks in this case, but it can be schools or shopping or mass transit or healthcare or whatever. And so looking at layers of these simulations, you can converge on a solution. And if you can get the proper land use, then you can design these lightweight mobility modes that can serve humans. These are all in red, the modes that we're working on, including walking. And just one example, this is a project that we've been working on for quite a number of years. It's a autonomous personal vehicle that comes to you like an Uber, but you drive it to your destination, you're in control. The autonomy is used for automated pickup, drop-off, rebalancing, and then off-peak, you can deliver packages door to door. So we're pretty excited about this project, and we're about to launch a project to develop a $1,000 version of that, hopefully. Resilient Andorra. So Andorra is a little country between Spain and France. We've worked with them for now about 5 years, and we're entering into a really exciting phase where they're doing universal serology and infection testing for everybody in the country, automated contact tracing. We've done a lot of work in that area. Digital proof of health certificates, immunity passports. We'll be looking at indoor activity sensing, Bluetooth beacons in hospitals, workplaces, shopping centers, etc. So people with the proper credentials, like I mentioned, can enter. How to design safe places, design and policy, match to that immunity status, agent-based modeling to run through these scenarios, etc. Now so that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what we need to do, just a few examples. But I think fundamentally, we need to move towards much more resilient systems, resilient economies. I mean, just getting the payments out to everybody in need is a nightmare. I think we need to look at new ways of financing projects, fractional ownership, et cetera. Resilient energy systems, microgrids and renewable energy, and producing most of the energy that is needed in a community locally when possible. Resilient healthcare systems. I mean, we can all see how fragile the healthcare systems are, how little extra capacity was in our system compared to other countries, and it in many cases came very near collapse. Resilient education systems, as we move towards, we had to move at MIT almost instantly to all online learning, all remote classes. We were not prepared for that. I think the future is some hybrid between e-learning and face-to-face learning.
I think on the bright side, we've seen things like edX, which was originally pioneered by MIT and Harvard and a few others, at least had started making a movement towards digital. But some things are really hard to move, and I think teachers are not ready for that either. So just, well,
they're not ready for that, and in some ways it's been a good thing because now they've been forced to dive in.
To try.
And we are learning really, really rapidly how to do this. In fact, it begs the question whether people will pay $50,000 plus a year to attend a Harvard and an MIT in the future.
Yeah. This whole question of this pushes us into new behaviors, and then what does it go back to as normal or as a new homeostasis? So, for example, of the stuff you've shown us so far, a lot of it has to do with how we reimagine space, how dense we are downtown, where transit is, how people use office buildings, right? And then you've got this whole bit about around safety in Andorra. What's your sense for when the dust settles? Are we still going to be in love with dense downtown offices, or will people have learned to work differently, which means we'll have a massive real estate to repurpose and a problem with real estate there, particularly if you can bring some of the automation you've shown to our homes, and we can turn the floor plate of our home into something that can be a Zoom screen and then a workout area and then a sleeping area, that changes a lot of the equation.
Yeah. I think there will be a lot of excess capacity. I think Kendall Square may be fine because it's a lot of biotech labs and, you need that special equipment. You can't really do that from home. But I think in many cases, companies might flip the pattern. Prior to this, many companies would have people work 1 day a week at home to catch up on their private work and 4 days in the office. That may flip. We may be working 4 days at home and 1 day in the office. You come into the office for those critical face-to-face meetings or brainstorming or using the Fab Lab or whatever. I mean, we'll see how that shakes out. I do think there'll be a lot of excess capacity in many places.
Well, it's interesting to think about, like, if we really went hyper-local for resilience, we'd want to have a little bit of urban farming on every other block. We want to have a lot of other things. Those are all things that we could use for that real estate for. But even this notion of let's go back to a 5-day work week. Well, I thought when I was a kid, they were talking about how we would, I watched the Jetsons, we were tired out if we pushed the button too much, I remember, because Rosie the Robot did stuff. Do we really want to go back to a 5-day work week? Could it be more sort of project and mission based and not even about, majors and disciplines, but more about missions?
I think for a lot of knowledge work, that's the case. And by the way, I had to laugh today because I got an email from Lufthansa that I lost my senator's status because I haven't been flying. Yeah. So I don't think I'll return to getting on an airplane every 3 or 4 weeks to fly overseas. I think those days are over.
Trips. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
I'd love to ask you a question, which also will be a good transition to bring Nigel in. In fact, why don't we bring Nigel Jacobs in from Boston? Hello, Nigel.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. Nigel runs the Office of New Urban Mechanics, which is the innovation office in Boston. I thought it would be great because here we have our academic in Boston, and then we have the man who actually is dealing with everyday redesign and changes in a city. And as a transition question, Kent, you showed us Andorra, which looked to be an almost perfect case of everyone was tested. We knew who people had come in contact with. We had safety information. So that almost seemed like the utopian ideal of we weren't doing bad things with privacy. We were preserving some fair state, and we knew what was going on. So we were able to maximize flexibility within this environment without authoritarian stuff going on. Could you describe that a little bit? And then I'd love to turn to Nigel and find out what actually will be going on, do you think, with some form of technology and contact tracing and testing, so you know what's going on, versus you're just trying to cajole people to be safe? Kent, we'll start with you.
In Andorra, when we were very excited because it's almost like a controlled experiment. There's only 2 roads in and out. One in from the north, from France, one from Spain, from the south. They have no airport. They have no train station. Everybody that comes in drives or takes a bus. The borders have been shut down, so nobody's entering or leaving. And it's a very small country. There are only 78,000 people. There are fewer people than the city where I live in, Cambridge, in the entire country. I know the ministers, and so they can act very quickly. And we're very excited to get all of the results of the testing as well, that we can correlate to the telecom data and hopefully draw some insight that can inform how people deal with this situation in the rest of the world. And I'm hoping they can largely establish the gold standard for how to deal with the pandemic.
We've had Tim Chang, who's a VC out here on our show, and he and his community in Bolinas, California, spontaneously bottoms up did this. They got everybody tested. They figured everything out. They figured out nobody had it, and they're basically trying to use that together with keeping track of who goes where to do this in a DIY way.
Well, of course, it's worth noting, Tim pointed out that the problem was signal to noise. There were 40 different PCR tests, and most of them were garbage because they had kind of been pushed through the FDA fast approval process. And it was actually more that they had to enlist local medical centers to help them figure out what was useful as testing so they could get out there. So it actually turned out to be a bigger logistics nightmare. Let's go to Nigel. What is the Office of New Urban Mechanics? I just like the name, but maybe a little background on that.
Sure. The Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, we've been around for about a decade. We're the city's innovation team. The idea is to introduce a culture of experimentation and risk-taking into local government. And we work on as many things as we can. We're a relatively small team, there's 10 of us. We work on everything from public education and transportation and physical infrastructure and beyond. And the thinking there is always, we should no longer be in a position of presuming to know the right answer in terms of how to make life better in a particular community or communities, but rather let's try some things to see what works and work in collaboration with the community to test those things and see what they like and what kind of impacts we can see as a result.
I like this notion. Go ahead, Peter. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to jump to follow up on the Kent question. Here you are, the innovation and tech world, and we're out to try to open a city back up. How are you making these trade-offs of testing, of contact tracing, all of these new mechanisms that are coming in that play off against privacy but give you public health, and then you have a public that may or may or not like it?
So, as I said, we're gonna try some things. I mean, on the front end, thinking about contact tracing and those kinds of issues, here in Massachusetts, the state has taken a lead, and much of that effort is an old school approach to contact tracing, which a lot of those Asian countries did, namely where you're calling people, right? You have someone, a newly, somebody that's been newly identified as having the disease, and you basically talk to them and check where they've been and who they've been in contact with, and you call all those people. And so in this era where people are increasingly out of work, I think we're treating this as an opportunity to both put these people to work, making these phone calls and so on. Now, as that will form the basis of contact tracing in this part of the world, we're actively we're looking, not just Boston, but a lot of cities are looking at how can we leverage the various contact tracing tools. I know Kent, I know there's a big effort at MIT that I've been involved in peripherally called SafePaths that is building like open source contact tracing platform, which we're looking at very closely to see how we could use that and how we could intersect that with the more traditional approach to contact tracing that we're taking here in Boston. A lot of the work up till this point for us has been first reconfiguring local government. I think it was really fascinating to watch how quickly and relatively seamlessly we moved to a more everything online and everyone at home kind of working environment that had fewer hiccups than we would have assumed. And once we had gotten that working, it was really a question of understanding. The mayor very quickly pushed us to think about how our at-risk populations can deal with the situation. How about homeless people? How about the elderly, people that are housing insecure more generally? And so for a lot of our work in neuromechanics, that's been the focus, looking at how we get food out to people, how do we come up with creative approaches to housing them, and so on. And we're just beginning to move into the next phase, the early stages. We're still, a lot of our work in terms of how we get to the next phase is predicated on first having enough testing going on, and that's slowly happening. I think probably in another several days we'll be where we need to be in terms of number of tests issued per day and so on. But that will then take us into this reopening and recovery phase of the work, where we are, again, trying to understand the need in the community and understanding how people, what kinds of resources do they need to be able to reopen in a safe way, and how do we give them support in helping, like the mom and pop bodega. How do you institute safe distancing, when your store is 20 square feet? And so there's a lot of that work happening. We're trying to understand the other needs that these other small businesses will require to be able to get to to be able to make it and be viable. And then, as Kent mentioned, thinking about public space is a huge issue for us. A lot of cities have begun to rethink the way they use lanes, traffic lanes in their city, especially in this time when we're encouraging people to maintain safe distance, social distance buffers around them as they make their ways through the city. So how that, for a lot of us, so I live in the North End in Boston, it's like a very dense, Jane Jacobs old digs, and very narrow streets. There really isn't any room if we're walking on the same sidewalk to maintain social distancing. And so we're trying to figure out how do we open up this new model of sharing roads with cars and other people and bicyclists and so on, and how do we encourage and support these new kinds of social norms? This is, the idea of crossing a street when you see another person coming was, was something that we tried to encourage for people not to do. But now that's increasingly becoming accepted behavior and even expected behavior. And so so there's a lot of these things happening.
It strikes me we're entering a moment for which there's no playbook. And Kent, I love your thoughts on this also. We don't really have a model for how dense something should be. And the feedback loops, they're like, 2 weeks of you try something, people get really sick in 2 weeks, it didn't work out too well. And on some level, all of America's like this now, in the sense that Texas and some of the Western states are going back early, so they're a bit of an experiment. The data is beginning to come in that perhaps urban density is a more important indicator of infection than even how quickly you isolated people. How are you dealing with the fact that this is a giant experiment for which, when you set up the equation, you're really not sure, like, exactly what numbers to plug in there, and therefore it's something between a guess and something between having to get a lot of data? You still with us, Nigel?
Yes. Was that for me? I thought that was for Kent.
Yeah, it
Oh,
sounded
well,
a
either
little
of
bit
you.
like
Nigel,
for
I'll
Kent.
ask you on a practical basis,
Okay.
and then Kent, maybe you can tell me. I mean, what we have is, Kent, you have these academic models and way of testing things, and I sense that here's Nigel at home with a bunch of people in Boston trying to figure out what to do for bodegas. So, we have an academic approach at MIT, and then we've got, like, in real world America, people trying to figure these things out, and then the public politically saying, screw that, I don't want a mask, and other people saying, well, tell me when it's safe. How do you work that, Nigel?
It's very difficult, right? Needless to say, one of the more difficult aspects of the crisis has been the tendency for communities of color to be more hard hit in many different ways by the disease than otherwise. And so we need to unpack that sort of in real time, right? Well, why are Black and Latino communities more adversely affected by this disease? I mean, I think we have a sense for why that is, but understanding what we do in response to that is very tricky. And how do you do that in a, frankly, democracy preserving way, right? This is another issue that I've been talking to my colleagues in other cities about. Like, how do we maintain the sort of traditional democratic values in the context of issuing all of these very invasive rules and requirements for people to how they interact with one another? I think that frankly, the way that we're going to go about it is by talking to people and sort of doing workshops and hopefully partnering with academic institutions. Kent is an old friend of mine, and trying to figure out how do we find the things that are the approaches that are effective and that are also acceptable by people in the city.
Hey,
So
Nigel,
I have a question. Go ahead.
Oh, all right. I'll take this one. Nigel, just in terms of, you said about 10 years ago this was set up, and it's about introducing a culture of innovation and experimentation. Mm-hmm. When you look back, or even at this moment, what experiments or what methods did you use to really engage the community to tackle these things? Like, what was the way you piloted stuff, and what are you planning right now, or what have you done that you actually get hope from in terms of an activity that you did in this distributed time?
Mm-hmm. The sort of things that we did were very much about taking a very designery flavored mode in which we engage people, right? It was very co-creative. We would make people, we were very careful not to make the people in a community the passive recipients of the things that we were trying to do, but rather to make them just as important partners as anybody else in doing these things. And so we found that if we don't assume people are stupid when we go into communities, and we can frame the mode of interaction just enough, we often find that people rise to the occasion, right? And then you put into, like, I remember in the early days, frankly, of 311, the very first, there was a lot of people, both in Boston and across the country, that thought that 311 systems would mostly be used to spam local government, right? That you'd be getting a lot of pouring through 311. And I can't speak for every city, but in our city that really didn't happen. I think by focusing on the utility of that particular channel and doing a good job and how we went about fixing it, people rose to the occasion and they use it as a channel. Not universally, and there are equity differences there, but by and large, these platforms were used to actually make communities better. By fixing the physical infrastructure, and just being honest about, if we can't repair that tree, by next week, we're just going to tell you that, and we're going to tell you, we're going to be honest about that. And so I think, we took that same approach in a variety of different experiments. We've had a long-term collaboration with a variety of different universities in around the Boston area, and we found that by taking a very co-creative, collaborative approach to thinking about playing with what the role of government is, or what the role of resident is, or citizen is, and how we getting into these things, I think that worked really well. And we're taking that same approach in how we think about housing. We have a unit of our team called the Housing Innovation Lab. We've taken the same approach in thinking about public education and infrastructure and so on. And so I am hopeful that if we can be disciplined in how we design the modes of interaction, that we can get to a better place, right? So it won't be us imposing requirements. When I say us, I mean local government imposing requirements, say of public space in the near future, but rather us facilitating a dialogue with the community in a positive and equity preserving or expanding way that I think we can get to.
Nigel, if you think about when you and I met and we did things like urban prototyping and hackathons, right? These were ways of very much including the public, and then we tried to make it even more inclusive, include middle school kids and coming up and they'd code things, right? And that was a very hopeful part of cities. And but it strikes me that almost like at a time when things move quickly and we don't know the answers, we need that kind of transparency, inclusiveness, and just honestly saying we're going to run experiments and you're part of it, and we have to figure that. And that's also an odd thing to tell a public that wants an answer.
It is, and
we don't know how to keep you safe. Certainly,
I think the idea, because the word experiment is often a non-starter in a lot of communities. It's like that people think about the Tuskegee experiment. I think there's a lot of
not good experiments.
Right. So,
I got
but piloting, maybe it's
but
piloting, maybe it's other things.
But I will say that when we talk about what the intent is, people get it. Like if I say to folks in the community, like we can't automatically do the right thing. We just don't know. But rather we think that by testing something and then seeing what works and what doesn't, and then making the thing better over time, people get that. It doesn't take a very long conversation. Again, I don't think people are stupid. I think that we have to also just be aware of like what has gone on in that community, right? So if I'm speaking to a community of color, I have to, and I say that if I use the language of being data driven, right? And I go into a community in Mattapan in Boston, there are people in living memory who are subject to redlining, right? Where they said Black folk don't move beyond this part of the neighborhood, right? So in that case, being data driven has a very negative connotation, and I need to be aware of that when I go into that community. And so I think like there's no substitute for knowing the territory and being anthropologically and ethnographically literate in how you're engaging with people.
Well, and maybe helping do that sort of code switching between one particular community and another community, like the policymakers or other people who really don't know. And I think a lot of this is about that interdisciplinary, each part of the organism and the organism of a city comes from a different truth and comes from a different point of view. And we can't say your truth isn't truth. They experienced it. But what we can do is try to look for ways that we can kind of bridge those truths. You remind me, as you were experimenting this idea of piloting and innovating through this process, Kent was showing something that was like little Lego pieces that people were able to put on there. And Kent, I don't know if you can come back in just for a moment and explain kind of what we were seeing there, because I think the idea was that it was co-created by community groups in Hamburg and
Well,
other
let
places.
me give you an example of one of my favorite projects that we did with the New Urban Mechanics Group. We set up 3 of our Cityscope platforms in the community center in Dorchester to investigate issues related to a proposed bus rapid transit system in Boston. And we had the regional scale where you could identify where you lived, where you worked, how it would change your commute time. The community scale, look at different routings, bus station locations, et cetera. And the street scale, bike lanes, no bike lanes, parallel parking, et cetera. And we had facilitators, not from my team, but from the community, who volunteered and were trained to do this, new people in the community. We invited people in, and we did not take a position on what was right or wrong. It was to get feedback from the community. And as they would move these optically tagged Lego pieces around different stations, they would, unfortunately I don't have that particular one, but similar.
This is good, yeah. But as they put those, they stack them on, it actually computed differently, right? Yeah.
So what you're showing us here is a mechanism that allows us to do city planning or space planning, that as you make physical changes, you see its impact, on transit or on what rent costs are. So it's kind of an interactive model that lets all of the constituents in planning see something.
What happened?
In the case of what we did in Dorchester, you would see, okay, how it impact the speed of cars, of buses, of commute time, the number of parking places in front of the post office, and then people would give their feedback, and we just collected the information. It was so much more effective than an urban planner making a presentation with an open mic where people stand up and yell at the speaker because the people that oppose an idea are most likely to show up.
Yeah, it's easy to be a
like you've given us
in the old system. Yeah,
you've given us a wonderful transition to now bring in an actual urban planner who not only is going to have all of these new tools in front of him, but every problem we've identified so far today. I just want to remind, first of all, thank both of you, and point out that you can learn more about both Nigel's work and the Kent's work over at MIT from our website at quarantine.today, and that this is episode 15. We're talking about the future of cities revisited, since so much is changing. And you can email us at quarantine@makercity.com. And if you're on Facebook or LinkedIn, you can type comments in and we will respond and talk today. And right now I want to bring in Jose Campos, who is our next guest. And Jose is in San Francisco and has been a key person in our planning operation. And Jose, you and I met when you were working on the Transbay Center that later became Salesforce Tower. You've been as strong an advocate for kind of transit-oriented urban development density as there is. You also have a history in the cruise industry. And now we're at a moment where so many of our assumptions are changing. And you're sitting here probably wondering what happens to office space, to tenants come back. What's it like right now among you and your fellow planners in San Francisco in the midst of this?
There's definitely a very strong and coordinated effort in the city among various departments to try to plan into the future, knowing that it's really not very possible at this stage, but at least first dealing with the health issue and protecting health. We're already doing that. That was the phase 1 or the shelter in place. But now we're like standing on, say, the space between the shelter in place and entering the pandemic. And a phase 2, as Governor Newsom has described in California, phase 2 of opening up the economy. So what that means is we know things are different. Some people know it more than others. On our teams or just working on the various things that we do every day, which tend to be like 2 or 3 years out. And we see change obviously on the horizon. We're trying to figure out how to react to it right now. But I think, although, there's a lot of sadness with respect to the disease and with respect to communities and families and people who have been affected, there's also, I feel, hope I feel that there is a desire to make out of this crisis a better city and a better, just say, community in general. Not only in San Francisco, but I think it's pretty strong in all of California.
Well, you know, this is we are an innovation-driven place, right? And California is probably as good an experimental place as any. But let's talk about some of those things that make a great city, right? We're a foodie town. We love dense, busy restaurants. We love North Beach because everybody's on top of each other there. And we've been working for a decade to make Market Street similarly dense and wonderful. We've become excited that there's a dense downtown, transit-oriented stuff around downtown. How do we imagine the future of that? Is there a future of restaurants without crowds? It's been tough for retail already. How are you measuring those kinds of fundamental retail, restaurant, amenity things that drive so much? And where do you think, what are the range of scenarios we're looking at here?
Well, our Mayor Breed, and the Chamber of Commerce and just civic leaders in general have set up a San Francisco Economic Recovery Task Force with specific committees dealing with the food sector. They're starting to meet. There are subcommittees. There's a Latino subcommittee as well. And what is interesting is that the people who are in the industry, who are working on this situation now, are the people who are going to be coming up with the solutions and the ideas. And so, like, at this moment, you know, I think it was already mentioned in this podcast that what's happening is an acceleration of trends that were already in place. We've seen just in our city, which is a vibrant city, we've seen retail storefronts suffering. And now, obviously, you know, the worst has happened. So what can we do now with this situation? We don't know yet. All we know is that there are people who are affected now, who are gathering together, who are coming up with ideas and solutions, and they are starting to coalesce and collaborate. And maybe there'll be a sort of like a co-opetition where they cooperate and they compete against each other in a way that's really healthy. So from an economic development and even just like a quality of life standpoint, I think, you know, in San Francisco, we're starting to get on top of it. But like I said, I feel like right now, like this week, we're in this phase where, oh, things might open up. So how do we deal with it really? It's been something where we were like first in shock when the shelter-in-place order, and we were the first community in the Bay Area in the country that was under shelter-in-place, and it was a shock to our system. And then it just started to become really fascinating, the way that we've morphed, like immediately everyone, you know, into digitization. Our permits are going through digitally before they were not, and now we were setting it up. We're like, we shortcut that process around 9 months, and people are reacting very positively. So that's why I'm saying there's a sense of hope amongst all this. So like with respect to restaurants and foodies, there's going to be a group, although I don't like that word foodie, frankly. Let's just say restaurants and just like agriculture and farmers, local farmers, and farm to table and the circular economy. There are all these thoughts that were already in place, and there are these issues already with just retail suffering. And now that we have perhaps, you know, a worse crisis with, well, not perhaps, but definitely a worse crisis with respect to retail, and in particular restaurants, what could the solution be? Well, you talked about real estate. There clearly will be some real estate space opportunities. You also talked about just, you know, the physical distancing that we have to do. Well, maybe we will be able to have more space to do more physical distancing in restaurants. But what I sense is going to happen is that it's going to be completely different. I feel that solutions that are going to come out of this may be like, for example, I was thinking of this idea where, you know, one thing that I hate is just excess packaging. And I always wanted to support the local farmers in the Bay Area. So why not do community supportive agriculture now that we're here at home and we're cooking all the time? So if we were to able to use one of the vacant storefronts, perhaps in my neighborhood in the Haight-Ashbury, then where I can pick up the community sustainable agriculture box every week, then I can develop not only a relationship with the farmer, but I could help, you know, just the landlord or whoever it is that has to deal with that vacant storefront in my neighborhood with my neighbors. So, I mean, this is just like a snapshot of kind of like this vision of, you know, the Bolinas example came up that was kind of like insular, like we're going to, or even Andorra, you know, it's like nobody's allowed in. Andorra is like completely based on tourism. So how long is that really going to last? You know, what happens when people come in and out? The solution can't be insular, but it definitely has to be local. The solution has to be also global. So it goes back to that old thought of, you know, think globally, but act locally.
A lot's been written about, let's talk about dense downtowns, right? So we've had an increase in rents and an exuberance of tech companies filling up downtown skyscrapers. Tech companies are the best companies that realize you actually don't need to do that. They're not light manufacturing, it's coders. And the coders are happy at home. And as I showed from one of the other slides, the tech companies are like, we can add to our bottom line if we don't go back to work. And in many ways, those kinds of knowledge workers have said, we want to be the last to go back to work for safety purposes because the butchers and the carpenters, they have to go first. What does this mean for space in our city? Could real estate rents drop? Is it going to be less office building? A lot of it, Sam Zell says it's going to be tough for real estate. Does that downtown space get converted into apartments?
Certainly it's going to be tough for real estate. And in particular, I imagine, the office market. It'll be interesting. And I'm talking about this wall that we're about to jump off into the next phase. It's like, what does that really mean? Like in our office, we're talking about, we're going to do, you know, we're going to go back and we're going to have one-way corridors, and then we'll just like put up some, you know, sneeze guards. And I'm thinking, do I even want to go back to the office? Maybe I don't have to. Frankly, I've been super productive here in my house. So I think that some folks, and it all depends on the situation, you know, maybe you own the office building and you just want everyone back there, or maybe you don't want to pay the rent, so everyone work from home. It's all going to play out. It's going to play out in the next couple of weeks, 2 months, and then we're going to see what are we going to do. Certainly there are offices, and we've already seen this, like from the 1950s when the Soho lofts were being converted to, you know, live work artist studios. Certainly there are office buildings that can be converted to residential, and that have been converted to residential, and that could be great. There are others that have really large floor plates, like, you know, they're like just big, thick office buildings where, you know, maybe there's some solutions. And I'm already thinking about like, okay, floor to ceiling height, you know, you have glass windows between bedrooms and the front. Yeah, sure. There are these options that you could do with the built environment that's in place. That's what redevelopment does or has done. And it can continue to do that. But we're not really there yet. You know, we're just starting to understand what it's going to mean for the real estate market. But I think one thing you need to think about, Peter, and all of us, is what do we not want back? What do we not miss? And I can tell you, I'm super happy that our sky is cleaner in the Bay Area. I'm extremely ecstatic about not having to commute to work or peak hour, you know, traffic. Do I want that back? Is that something that we want back? Why in the hell would we want that back? So we need to ask the question, what is it that we actually don't want back? What do we not miss? And how does that evolve into, say, an urban plan, you know? Or
I love this question. What do we not want back? You know, what are the things that people are all like walking the streets? I mean, I noticed a bunch of streets closed, and just, you know, to give a little bit more distancing. But I see a lot of people out, at least playing with their dog or walking the streets or whatever. And I think a lot of people felt that there was this ego play of work that was like, I'm putting in more hours than you are, you know, and that doesn't mean you did anything. You put in more hours, great. You answered all those emails, but actually this notion of a work-life balance, I think, is being relitigated right now in a pretty dramatic way, because people are like, wait a second, the promise of technology that was that we would actually not, you know, we wouldn't live just to work. We would actually get the joy of work, because it is obviously, it gives us meaning, but we would also get the joy of not working.
Right.
And sort of that mental space.
You already said that earlier. You said, I mean, part of what is it that we don't want is what is it that we do want. Yeah. And you said that what you don't want, I mean, I'm just putting words in your mouth, but what I heard you say is that you really don't want the 5-day work week back. But what
I
you
wonder about it. Yeah.
mission-based
Yeah.
work program.
Because, by the way, I mean, I have killed myself a long time ago. I had to help design and build and launch the biggest or the second biggest structure at the Olympics in Sydney. So back in the 90s, in 2000, I went through this process of like 24-hour days, going back and forth to Australia and Seoul and all that stuff. And just my own personal life of building big things, a designer experience, etc. And I would like to do that occasionally, but it is a hell life because it becomes a weird drug of like the show opens and all that. But every once in a while, it's an amazing experience because a lot of people level up all at once, and the opening day is the Olympics and things like that. So it's like we almost want to hit everything with a hammer. If we're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If we can say, what do we not want and what do we want? But let's not throw too much out of the baby with the bathwater, because it could be that some of those things that actually are just hard work are really what give us meaning.
It may be
that we have
that
to think about this. The last comment I wanted to throw maybe back at Jose and the whole team is, the first episode that we had on Quarantine had Andrew Hessel, who's in charge of the Human Genome 2.0 project, right? The first one was reading the human genome. This is the writing the human genome. It's a sort of a moonshot. And recently, John Cumbers from the Synth Beta Bio group put a whole list of how to take California and make it the leading edge for the biological revolution. In terms of this is some stuff, and they sent it up to Gavin Newsom last week, and they basically outlined all the ways that California, Boston, some other places are sort of synthetic biology capitals. And when we can actually get a harness the smallest piece of life, which is this 51 kilobit thing called the coronavirus, it's smaller than a Word document that doesn't have any words in it. When we can harness that, we're probably going to be able to do all sorts of things that we would never be able to do before. From a disease and a cancer and a life and wellness standpoint. So we may not want to completely design away us being able to be together, because it turns out humans being together is a kind of a beautiful thing.
Right.
So we may want to say products could help. They're just not here today or tomorrow.
And we need to think like in the different phases. The other speakers have spoken about this. It's like you have, okay, now we're out of the shelter in place and we're phasing in this living in the pandemic, because the pandemic's still here and it's going to last. But hopefully, God willing, inshallah, in a year, 2 years, hopefully not 3, but could be, then it's done. The vaccine happens. We're all out on the street. I'm on the board of directors of a group called Sunday Streets in San Francisco. So we're already planning big
I love it.
street events, like citywide. Like
the cyclovias that happen in Bogota and other things where they just close streets and it's all bicycles and things like that.
Right.
I think that's huge.
And
Sunday
streets. It came out of that. So the idea is look at this, how do we live in the pandemic and how do we change things? Well, we're going to need more space in the public realm. And so, Peter, you asked about the real estate market. We really need to address initially, and we're in planning department and others are already doing that now in San Francisco, the public realm. We can use some of Ken's tools and Nigel's ideas too. We should all be collaborating. But in the public realm, what do we do? How do we expand the public right of way for pedestrians? It's something that we've always talked about, but now we have to do it. So how are we really going to do that? And we've already done it. The city has established the Slow Street program in San Francisco, just a block away on Page. Is a slow street where cars aren't allowed. It's really for people to walk and do things. And New York's done the same, other cities. But I mean, we need to look at like abroad and collaborate with other cities, maybe through the I'm not involved in C40, but of course I read about it all the time. But I read about what's happening in Paris. Paris has already been on a cutting edge. What they've done with the Rive Gauche, they basically closed down the autoroutes around the Seine. But now they're going full throttle under the leadership of Anne Hidalgo. But Mexico City, Bogota, as you mentioned, Mickey, Milan, Barcelona, these are all places that are really starting to pedestrianize the public right of way in ways like now. Like
you're really describing, in a way, getting back to the form of new urbanism that started coming in the 80s or 90s, or was pioneered perhaps by John Lindsay when he closed the parks in New York, that say we prefer people together versus the car thing that came in the 20th century. You're suggesting that when we get out of the pandemic, we're actually going to get back to what Jane Jacobs wanted, because we're going to like being together, and we're going to try to get rid of more vestiges of 20th century urban form.
We're going to be dealing with a situation for the next couple of years. What are we going to be doing to deal with that? That's going to be long lasting. And what I meant, the next wall we'll have to jump over, which is now the pandemic's done. That big V-Day happened, and we got the vaccine V-Day, and we're out. We're back. Obviously, we're going to be more careful about pandemics in the future. I'm hoping. But
So
but we're going to have to, like anything that we're designing now, we want to carry forward in the future. It's because that's what we really want. We don't.
Charles Delicio asks a question, which is this trade-off between we want walkable cities, but we have all these restaurants that operate on 4% margins, and if we tell them to double the table space over the next 2 years, the business model falls apart. Plus, people have to want to come back. So, one of the questions is, I don't know, are there different forms of how we do these things that drive density? Are there ways that is it because we will be eating out? Will we be eating out densely or not? Or one other thought to put on the table, Derek Thompson in his Atlantic article says basically we're going to hollow things out. There'll be a real estate crash. People will leave cities. It'll look bad. But when it comes back, not unlike the forest fire cleaning the forest, suddenly the city will attract people for whom it's affordable and for whom they're arty and quirky, and there'll be a new cycle of what San Francisco loved. But I guess the question is, how do we mitigate the pain and get what we love sooner, because it's very fragile
for the recovery?
Yeah, by a lot of things that the city's doing already, and you do more of it and everywhere. It's just like collaboration, even at the street level, the neighborhood level.
Yeah.
How are you going to transform your district and therefore the city in a way that is going to address these concerns? In my neighborhood, I'm looking right now over Haight Street, and I can see all the boarded up storefronts from my window. Yeah. And what's going to happen in a month or in a couple of weeks or even this week? We have a record shop. They're allowed to open. Thought that was interesting. What,
Amoeba?
Yeah.
Hey,
exactly.
Can you predict for me what summer is going to be like? So, like, I'm sitting here. First of all of my friends and I, we don't know what the rules are. Like, how many are we allowed to hang out with? Are we breaking the rules if 10 of us get together? When will we be allowed to go to a restaurant?
How come we don't get those on the cell phone automatically? Like when somebody gets kidnapped, I'm not seeing anything like, hey, by the way,
we bring Nigel back in. You're also in a real city, but I guess here's the question I have. I want you to tell me. I want to paint a picture of the scenarios of what my August might be like. I can tell you that I'm not going to Burning Man this August. Am I going to be hanging out with 10 friends on a farm somewhere? Will I be going downtown and I'm going to be back to a dense restaurant? I'm going to be in Absinthe drinking with friends. Paint for me my urban summer, both of you, please.
Well, in Boston, I suspect you're probably not going to be celebrating the 4th of July in exactly the same way, because it's a very dense, downtown, right? Yeah, it's. I wish I could predict it for you, Peter. It's going to be a fascinating and interesting summer. Like, how do you socially distance at the beach? I'm not sure. I think
I can picture all sorts of new swimwear. I'm excited about this.
Exactly.
I think there's a lot of product innovation here.
Right.
I can see hats that are beautiful, super 6-foot hats.
Everything's digital now. Don't you know that? It's just digital. Get over it. It's digital.
I don't know if I want to go to the beach digitally though.
Yeah, that doesn't. If Burning Man could simulate sand, I think in their virtual version, I would feel a lot better. The way it gets in your everything, your toes and everything. Jose, where do you go with this?
But maybe the beach and places like that, we will have figured out. Certainly, I don't know if we're going to be going to, football games, but don't you think that at least we'll have the beach figured out?
I have a theory that we're going to go to interesting out-of-the-way places. So, for example, the Hamptons is not a good idea because that's just Manhattan dense again on the eastern side of Long Island. So that doesn't really solve for anything. On the other hand, the Inland Empire or, areas north of Joshua Tree, remote areas, hanging out there, that's nice. It's probably good for wine country. It's less dense up there. So, we may discover different kinds of places. Speaking of adaptive systems and the summer, I'm going to put an image up. It's a Rorschach. Amit, if we could have the next picture. Here, what is this? These are cruise ships stranded off the coast somewhere as an armada waiting for what to do.
Oh my God.
What I'm pretty certain of is they're not going to be cruising people around. And there's a lot of new cruise ships coming on and a lot of old ones. And Jose, I want to ask you this question because you have a background in the cruise industry, and there's a lot of talk going on now that old cruise ships should be brought into port and turned into housing, either homeless housing or housing. But there's a lot of capacity. There's more of that capacity. How about that for adaptive reuse? People talking about that kind of stuff?
Good question that I don't know the answer to, but I do know what we were talking about before. So yes, around 10 years ago, I was the Secretary General of the Association of Mediterranean Cruise Ports, based out of Barcelona, and so therefore, you know, I'm very intimate with the sector. However, since then, I haven't really worked in it, and with the pandemic, I've been hibernating, and I've been very reclusive, not wanting to reach out yet because I just emotionally not able to do that. I have so many friends in that industry, really dear people, wonderful people. I even have tourism books from when I was in the industry, and I don't know what they're dealing with now. But eventually I will reach out to them. So I feel like it's premature to opine. And I'm certain that I've heard already that, you know, there's some hopeful thinking with respect to August, Norwegian cruise line, and I believe it was, I don't remember if it was a Carnival cruise line. But it's sad. It's extremely sad. And I can tell you that with respect to just the people who have suffered and who will suffer this season, from a business standpoint. But what I'm thinking of is, in my mind, is that when I was doing that work, one of the things that our organization was spearheading was something called shoreside electricity. And it's otherwise known as cold ironing. And it's something that I think in Europe it's happening more with ferries, perhaps. But it's really a way, because the fuel, basically keeping a ship at port, it's like a little city, and the ship has to be fueled with energy to function. And generally that's, a fuel that, it's a bunker fuel, or it's a low sulfur fuel, but it's a fuel that it will create too much air pollution if it's just permanently at port. So even on days of ports of call, visits at ports, the entire West Coast, from San Diego up to Alaska, the ports have established this cold ironing, the shoreside electricity. And I believe, at least last time I was working on this, and it's probably expanded, but Princess Cruise Line and Holland America outfitted their vessels to basically be able to be at port in a sustainable way. In San Francisco, we have Hetch-Hetchy, we have basically large hydro electricity. It's totally, carbon free. So that electricity does nothing with respect to emission, fuel or carbon emissions. So it's a good thing. In an area, obviously, where you're using electricity that comes from coal, not the same issue. But I was starting to think, if a ship were to be at port and it were to serve a function and not just be, kind of nothing, then it could come to the Californian ports and to Washington State and Alaska, because we have these facilities set up. And maybe there's opportunities, and maybe it isn't just, because a friend of mine already came up with this concept of converting part of, it was an idea. He's an architect, of basically finding an old cruise ship that is out of commission or about to be out of commission, and creating a homeless shelter or facility. And so, this is part of that creativity that has to happen out of the stress.
What this conversation is showing us is ideas that we might have entertained as a dream or as an off-hour thing or just a student prototype thing. These these may be the real ideas, in the sense that we have to entertain a lot of new stuff right now. Like we have to think differently, because it's just not going to be some big real estate guy with another tower. It's going to be something else. As many of you know, Dale Doherty and Marcia and I wrote the book, The Maker City, based on a lot of the prototyping collaborative work that we were doing here in San Francisco. So maybe, as we kind of come into the home stretch here, this notion of both engaging our public, our students and our artists and our architecture students, our Burning Man people who won't be going to apply this year, but all of whom have creative ideas and can build and create and prototype. I'd love to think through how we might engage our communities in imagining a future, and also kind of parceling out the kinds of things to work on, because we're talking about lots of forms of adaptive reuse, different use of space, artistic talent. And also we would love our quarantine family and audience to kind of turn into a set of projects. And here in San Francisco, we have a long history of doing these things, as do you guys in Boston. How might we approach this? And Mick, you are the
comment on this.
So you can lead us through this ad hoc exercise.
So, and it relates to what Nigel said and what Ken has been doing, everybody. Years ago, I started an educational institute called Luma, and we've taught about 80,000 or so people around the world, human-centered design, and basically what Nigel was talking about, right? How do we have co-creation? How do we discover the need knowers? How do we help them be stakeholders and co-create? And if we don't do that at this time, if we just say, hey, you've got cool ideas, let's go do it, I think we will get the same tech answers, which are people who, like Elon Musk, doesn't actually understand humans, right? So if he goes to Mars, we should shut the door in the hopes that he doesn't come back. That's okay. But I mean, he literally doesn't get humans. And I think it's really important for us to try to look at what might be humane, but also thrivable in this space. So I'm hoping it's human-centered, and it puts people first in this space. For example, I do remember cruise ships being discussed as a way to cope with some refugee problems and some other things, water refugee problems and stuff a few years back. And the problem is it alienates and isolates those refugees from the actual communities. And then it creates basically breeding houses for things like terrorism and other kinds of things, because you can have local despots and others that kind of become strongmen, and you don't want that probably. So I would hope that whatever we do, we're clever about this. I'm a little surprised there isn't sort of a Ori from Kent's world, the sort of robotic reconfigurable thing, mash up with Carnival, so that they can actually just have programmable, reprogrammable spaces, and that they're net positive, not net zero, because there are certainly many buildings in many places that have already moved over to net positive. So this notion that a few people have planted, circular economy, right? Why is it that every tourist who comes into a city, with actual amazing raw materials in the form of those packaging and those things that they bring with them, why don't we keep that stuff before they leave, so that we actually think of it as raw, beautiful resources? There are a whole bunch of things we could think differently about if we actually looked at total lifetime kind of value instead of this kind of very immediate stuff. So that's my 2 cents. Is I actually think exactly what all three of these guests today are talking about are really important for us to think about. Anyway, I just appreciate you being on and taking time out of a crazy time.
You may have to roll off, so I wanted to just turn to you and just say, in this moment of kind of invention and possibility, kind of how would we inspire kind of a larger group of people to both imagine or perhaps have access to the kind of planning tools you're talking about, so we can include our communities in building a better, more resilient what's next? And then how do we turn this into specific to-dos? Because don't forget, we have an awful lot of students that aren't going back to school for the rest of the calendar year. So there's cognitive surplus of people who want to build their future hanging around right now.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think this pandemic has really hit a big reset button, and everybody is rethinking things. And for example, I'm trying to get a grant approved at the Office of Sponsored Programs here at MIT, and the word was they are just inundated with working through COVID-19 grant proposals and this influx of funding, and everybody in our community is trying to reposition their work to solve this problem, and not to work on academic projects, but to work on things that can have impact in the world in the short term. And so that's very exciting. The other thing is I found working virtual has made it so much easier to connect. You know, we have these collaborators all over the world, and I used to think I would have to get on an airplane to connect with them. I don't now. I connect with them, you know, every couple of days, and that's not going to change when we come out of this. And I think e-learning, I think you know, it's whatever education becomes in the future is not going to go away. We're going to have this kind of hybrid, you know, building things and then transferring information and discussions online. And I think we can much more easily build this international community that can solve problems. So I think there are some silver linings here with this terrible situation.
We have had in the last decade, 2 decades, the real move towards megacities and spectacular downtown, San Francisco and New York and such, perhaps at the expense of our smaller cities. But as part of the whole American urban experience, we've also had times when we thought we liked garden cities or suburban cities, and America has many, many secondary cities. So is perhaps part of our next experience more growth in neighborhoods, more smaller, resilient things, both because perhaps they're just less expensive and therefore less capital and therefore more financially resilient, but also because they're more distributed and you know, less pandemic prone? I'm just thinking about what this might mean for, you know, for Reno or Sacramento, the Central Valley, as well as even the neighborhoods here in San Francisco as smaller units.
I would hope that would be the case. I mean, I think it could give some competitive boosts to these tier 2, tier 3 cities. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that people will still want to be in New York City and Manhattan and San Francisco. I mean, people love these vibrant, high density cities. And by the way, you asked a question about density. I don't think density is the issue when it comes to the pandemic, as much as social and cultural norms. I was on a phone call with somebody from the Taipei city government the other day. Do you know, in the entire country of Taipei, they have 440 infections. They've had 6 deaths. And her point was that we got ahead of this. You know, everybody wears a mask. You know, everybody socially distances. We haven't had to shut our schools down. I think they did shut the schools down, our workplaces, our restaurants. You know, in Shanghai, I have a friend in Shanghai. There's single point of entrance into large apartment buildings, meaning that they can do temperature checks at one control point and make sure everybody washes their hands, et cetera, and do good surveys. So yeah, density increases transmission, all things being equal. But if you have really good policy in place and good social norms, I don't think density is as much the issue.
I made a point at the top of this that places like Taiwan and other places in Asia, having been through pandemics, actually developed the antibodies to pandemics, in that they masks are fine and they're willing to do these mechanisms. In America,
well, also, I mean, in Singapore, I was talking to somebody who's from there. He's a tech entrepreneur here, but he said, you know, because they had the previous virus, the SARS and some other stuff, all the schools actually do normal drills where they actually do drills just like we do for fire drills or earthquake drills or whatever. They do drills to, like, if there's an outbreak, what do you do, and things like that. I have seen no talk of that. And I mean, I'm depressed already coming from Chicago to San Francisco and not really seeing a culture of people having a conversation of where their go box is. If there's an earthquake, how do they actually, where do they all meet at the high point? Where's a stable piece of land? And I know that happens in some places, but it's not a cultural norm. And yet, you know, San Francisco and California is sort of open to many wrath of God kind of parts of things, from mudslides to earthquakes to wildfires. And we haven't turned it into like a cultural thing. And I do think, to your point, Kent, if we actually just started saying, how do we actually think about this as being sane citizens in a complex world, and turned it into something where we learn, it actually builds community. You know, when you're even doing a simulated, oh no, there's been an outbreak, or oh no, there's been a whatever, doing it regularly might be of value.
That's resilience. You know,
Yeah.
resilient
Well,
culture.
I'd like us to move past
Resilient human.
resilience to anti-fragility, but I would take resilience as a starting point.
Yeah.
I think we also have to be mindful about democracy, frankly. I mean, if we want to keep it, we could make the world a lot more resilient in so many ways if we didn't care about democracy, right? And so our world, our culture is what it is for lots of different reasons, and democracy is an aspect of that, for better or worse. And so I think in my mind, a lot of the challenges about, and we also have deeply inequitable American cities, right? Like poor people and people of color are suffering differently than people that live right in different parts of the city. And so it's a complicated, we often are a lot of our we get lots of questions about why they do this in Asia or they do this in Northern Europe.
Yeah, why don't you just do this?
Totally different scenarios, right?
Totally different world.
Look at
exactly
Mississippi and compare Mississippi to anywhere in Norway, right? So there's a lot of complicated issues that we have to face as a country and as a society before we can get there.
Well, the good news is we get hybrid vigor, right? Like America is an amazing experiment because of the hybrid vigor of having so many different nationalities and so many different things. The idea of this app called America, bring us, you're tired, you're lonely, you're poor, and whatever, was actually a pretty awesome idea. We're still going through beta testing, I think, and unfortunately, we stumble a bunch of times. But this notion gives us hybrid vigor, and nature loves this, right? If we look at patterns in biomimicry for resilience, hybrid vigor is one of them, right? Single species, single things are really open for collapse very quickly. So, I mean, America has that. What do we do with it? And unfortunately, it's, some inequities have never been reckoned with.
There's
and we struggle with that
notion of American exceptionalism, that we have to invent it. We can't learn from other people.
Right.
I think that has served us well,
Yeah, we have to be humble too.
Some industries, but it's not made us very humble when it comes to learning from what's been successful in other countries, whether it's healthcare, how they deal with the pandemic or contact tracing. I mean, up and down the line.
Now, some of this, on a national level, right? You could argue we're becoming more nationalistic and we're expressing that. But this is also a great federalist moment. There's more cities and states expressing themselves. Are we seeing? I mean, and basically, you're all sitting here in innovation networks. Nigel, you're an innovation group. You work with other innovators in cities around the world. Kent, that's what you have, and we certainly have that in San Francisco. Are we seeing collaborations across cities right now, or between like student groups and cities, where we can see new ideas bubbling up? Because forget about the national government; they got other things to solve.
I will say that I have over the last month, had these kind of networks have been set up for several years, but I feel like everyone is under incredible pressure, and I'm finding there's just a different level of like openness and just and authenticness in how we're sharing. I was talking to someone like me in Anchorage, right? Anchorage is not very similar to Boston, but we were having a pretty engrossing conversation about how it was working there and what we could learn and so on. So I feel like we could have had that conversation before, but we never did. And so I think like now, where it's getting down to brass tacks in a lot of situations, is like, well, how do we actually get that thing to work, whatever it happens to be? So
I'm heartened to hear that like cities are experimenting together, because so often it seems like it's us against the world. We'll solve it. And of course, there are very unique properties to every city. But as Peter started this whole conversation, if you read Geoffrey West's book on scale, he was able to find incredibly resilient patterns across cities that predicted the number of patents, the pay rate, how fast they walked, that actually had to do with just sort of the packing levels. It was actually based on sort of fractal structures, but incredibly resilient patterns across all cities. And I would just love to see more of a cities laboratory where the cities themselves all think of themselves as this. And I'm excited to hear that, that you're hearing, and this latent network that was there is actually getting activated. It might be more interesting to see how Anchorage would solve Boston's problems than necessarily just talking about it too. So having kind of co-creation sessions across cities, because actually one of the tricks in innovation is to do something called alternate worlds, which is, if I'm stuck in thinking of urban planning all the time, I can't really imagine it. But if you ask me, what would Nike do, or what would Disney do, or what would it be if it was a restaurant? Whoa, my head explodes, because it's an alternate world. So I love this idea of enabling the cities, but I'd love to also see co-creation across them, because it turns out different cities have different skill sets. And if we looked at it as a network loosely joined, it would be very powerful.
Well, it strikes me, when we next convene, we should come back armed with our populations, emboldened by the brilliance in our cities, and energized by the capacity of our students and our citizens to create something. Like, we actually should come back prototyping, or with our cities, to go work on problems here, because this is a time for that, and that's what we're talking about. We talk about this a lot in the show, and What's Next, just to tease something and to show you how the past goofily comes up with the future. I want to just show this. In 2010, in New York, the storefront for art and architecture had an exhibition, a group exhibition called Landscapes of Quarantine. And they examined many forms of quarantine. Quarantine because of disease, quarantine because of prison, quarantine for technical reasons. And these are some of the projects that came here. I love this one. This is the Manual of Architectural Possibilities. Mostly invisible, but physically influential. Area of containment could range from a single cell to an entire planet, from the political to the religious. Some geographies are so polluted that they would be considered quarantined landscapes if they were living beings. And it talks about how many bacteria a public fountain can hold. And then they also had this other kind of great piece, the last one here, which are the different things: zoos of infectious species, quarantining a library, a bunch of ideas. Now, it turns out, if you go back through Places Journal and other both the cultural institutions and magazines that cover placemaking, these ideas have resonated for centuries. In fact, disease is a part of cities and design for centuries. So there's both a great deal of thinking here, and even these trouble situations can spur forms of creativity. So I just wanted to put that on the table, kind of as we wrapped up here. And okay, we can bring everybody back so we can thank them. It's about 5:31, so it's probably time to go home, because it's past dinner in Boston.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much, Kent. We will be back in touch soon. There's so much exciting stuff going on with your lab, and we haven't even gotten to the work that you're doing on contact tracing, zero knowledge proofs, and how do we accomplish protection and privacy at the same time, which we should probably just do a show on that.
Okay.
Jose, I'll see you. Well, hopefully I will see you soon, and I'm certainly going to see different use of a land here in San Francisco soon. And Nigel, great getting in touch. Mick, we should tell people about what's coming up next week. Wednesday, we're talking about leadership in unknown seas with you and with Martin Reeves, who's a colleague of yours at BCG. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think we're still tentative on that, but I'm hoping it's going to happen. We really wanted to look at what are business leaders thinking. How are they going to come back? What's going to happen? How are we going to drive business innovation in the time of quarantine? And Martin is the chairman of the Bruce Henderson Institute. It's named after the founder of BCG. BCG being one of the top 3 strategic consultancies in the world. And Martin is the chairman of that, and he is just an incredible thinker, sort of very complexity system thinker about new forms of leadership. How might we, win this fight against COVID, but also come out of it in a better place from a sustainability standpoint, from a triple bottom line standpoint, and other kinds of things. And how can we do things like increase the rate of learning, over this period of time, so that we don't keep doing the same things over and over again and expecting different answers.
That's our show on Wednesday, the 13th. And then on Friday, the 15th, a week from today, it's news, truth, and propaganda in the time of COVID. First of all, news itself is going through a crisis. Local news, which was already in trouble because of online news, suddenly the advertisers, the retailers, and the local merchants, they're not paying the bill, and yet local news is more important than ever. But if you're in the news business, moving between what's facts and how do you talk to the public at a time when everything about this pandemic changes frequently, how infectious it is, what the death rates are, the statistics that are used. You can see the stuff gets incredibly politicized. And so that becomes very important. So we're going to be on the show with us is going to be our good friend Craig Foreman, who is the CEO of McClatchy. McClatchy is the largest independent newspaper group in the U.S., runner of local newspapers, including the Miami Herald, the Sacramento Bee, the Fresno Bee. So we're going to get into local news. And then we're also going to talk about the mind virus and its attack, the fact that there's an enormous amount of disinformation, anti-vaxxers creating stuff, fake videos out there, and all of this stuff comes in very similar ways to the vectors that disinformation came in the 2016 campaign, and it's happening in real time. We've seen it before. The political world, you could argue, was ready to be attacked by people, but actually, the public health community was not. So this is an interesting thing. So joining us for that will be Yael Eisenstadt. Now, Yael, who is a former CIA officer and is now a visiting fellow at Cornell Tech, was also national security advisor to VP Biden, and she headed Facebook's election integrity operation for political advertising until she resigned and became a public critic about how social media platforms are really destroying civil discourse, and they're harming democracy. Basically, because of how they're built, they just can easily amplify a discord. And if you've read Roger McNamee's book or read any of Tristan Harris's work, it's in that ilk. So on Friday, we're going to dive into how those same platforms and mechanisms are complicit in COVID disinformation and conspiracies, how many people we all know are being turned by this kind of propaganda, and what to do about it. To evoke a Cold War meme, next Friday, we'll be exposing the Manchurian virus on Quarantine. So that's what's coming up in the next week. I want to thank our great group today to take a look at the future of cities, which really is the future of where we'll be spending the rest of our lives, big cities or small. We'll see you again next week. You can reach us at quarantine.today. Our email is quarantine, Time, at makercity.com. Right now, it is 5:36 Pacific Quarantine. I'm Peter Hirschberg, and we'll see you next week.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.